Okay, so the final book that I've got out from the British Sundial Society library to show you is one of their very older books. The collection includes a number of books from the late 17th and 18th century, and they're an absolutely fascinating collection because they show Enlightenment thought, they show the spread of knowledge, the interest in sciences, in mathematics and astronomy and geography, and the way that this kind of knowledge was being investigated and disseminated in that period of the European Enlightenment. So the book that I've chosen to get out today is this book here. It has, as many 18th century books have, an incredibly long title, which is An Introduction to Geography, Astronomy and Dialling, containing the most useful elements of the said sciences, adapted to the meanest capacity by the description and use of the terrestrial and celestial globes, with an introduction to chronology. The second edition, in which, besides many other great additions, are about 20 paradoxes belonging to the globes, entirely new, as also the construction and usage of refracting and reflecting telescopes, etc. So this book, as it says, was the second edition of this book, published in 1729, and it's by George Gordon. I haven't been able to find out much at all about George Gordon. All I've been able to find via some internet searching is that he, in about the same period, also published a corrected edition of a work called An Astronomical Dialogue Between a Gentleman and a Lady. So clearly he was somebody who was interested in astronomy and sciences, and just unfortunately has kind of fallen out of knowledge. So we don't really know where he was born, when he lived. But he obviously seems to have been publishing in the 1720s. Now this book is really interesting. It's actually got an awful lot of really useful and interesting information in it. It's intended to be read by beginners. It's intended to be read by people who don't know a lot about the sciences in question, and it includes all sorts of things. It starts with explanations of things like longitude and latitude and geographical terms, and then goes on to a description of the countries. So it lists different countries in the different continents and describes each of them. So I thought I'd just show you the description for England because it made me giggle. So of England, there's information about the size of the country and so on. But what it specifically says is, it is in general a fine country, being mountainous on the outside, but within land generally level champaign, which means kind of open flat lands, and well watered, abounding with corn and cattle, of a good and temperate air, and inhabited by a people of good natural disposition, of good parts, and famous for their courage. So I haven't read all of this. I suspect that some of the descriptions of the way that different countries were thought of in the 1720s may be absolutely dire, but some of them clearly are quite interesting and quite fun. So it then goes on to include some ways of solving problems that you might have geographically. So things like how you would work out the latitude and longitude of where you were, or how you would use a globe to work out which countries were in similar temperate zones, for instance. And then it gets broader. It starts to talk about using a celestial globe as well in similar ways, talking about the solar system, talking about the planets, the phases and motions of different planets and so on. And there are a number of plates, fold-out plates included. So, for instance, this one explaining how eclipses work and happen, which I particularly like the fact that the moon's got a little smiley face on it every time it's shown, in order to differentiate it from the sun. So that's rather lovely. And it then goes on to talk about the use of globes and sundials and so on, and the construction and use of telescopes and chronology. Now it also has some interesting aspects to it as a book, as an object. So for instance, it's handily fallen open to this page. In the front here there is a note to say that if you had bought this book and were getting it bound, this was where you should put each of the fold-out plates. Because of course in the early 18th century, books were usually bought without their binding. So they were bought either just in a paper binding or just as a loose set of leaves. So you would get it bound yourself. What's also really interesting about this book is all the signatures and inscriptions that have been added to it. Now, it's fairly clear that this book at some point belonged to someone called John Crofts. His name is in this book about 30 times, also including his initials, IC, I obviously being in place of J. And the dates that are with the inscription of John Crofts' book, tend to be from 1758 through to around about 1762. Interestingly, they're different handwritings being used to do this inscription. And together with this here, this makes me wonder about something. So here we have the preface. I have read this book and think it will be very useful to beginners. This in itself is quite interesting. It's effectively a quote saying you should buy this book. The chap who made the quote, I have his full name, it's a great name, John Theophilus Desaguliers, who lived from 1683 to 1744, was a scientist, engineer, clergyman. He was a member of the Royal Society and an experimental assistant to Isaac Newton within the Royal Society. So this is basically them saying, you know, getting a quote from a famous person. But underneath it, someone has written, I have read this book. And I suspect this is somebody practicing their handwriting. Somebody practicing writing by copying what they can see printed in the book. And I wonder whether some of this is the same. Clearly the book was owned by John Crofts, but maybe other people have been copying John Crofts' book in order to practice their writing, because these are clearly different handwritings. There's also a little note here that William something Crofts, I can't read the middle name, William something Crofts was born 1774, December 25th, presumably that's the son of John Crofts, and on the front page we have twice that the cost of this book was 5 shillings. In 1758. I had a look online. There is an interesting website that will allow you to work out how much that would have been worth nowadays. And there are various different ways of looking at it, but looking at the cost of labour, so based on average wages, that means that this book at the time would have had the value of what today would be around about £480. Based on the cost of, as I say, average wages. So that in itself is quite interesting. Also at the back of the book, John Crofts has written an entire, almost, essay in the back. I have transcribed this. Basically it says, John Crofts, his book, 1759, I desire that whosoever should have this book, that you will make a good use of it and learn what you can, and by seeing this work, I would have you consider by your own conscience whether you do proceed in the way of salvation, for the way that this book teaches will not bring you to the heavenly Jerusalem. Meditate upon the things concerning the soul, as well as this book, for this is natural and that this is spiritual. So that's really interesting as well, as kind of a note at the end saying this book is really interesting and will teach you a lot, but also remember to look after your your spiritual side as well, which brings again brings up issues of the kind of contradictions that were being discussed during the Enlightenment. So all told, this book is absolutely fascinating, both as an insight into the way where science was in the 1720s, but also as a piece of social history, as an object and what it can tell us about the people who owned it and used it, how they used it, and the life that it's led, basically, before it came to be part of the British Sundial Society Library.